Pittsburgh. An April morning that felt as quiet and ordinary as any other. The early spring chill still lingered in the air. A thin veil of mist settled over the red brick rooftops of Stanton Heights. The sound of early birds and the smell of coffee drifting from front porches carried the familiar sense of safety that residents here had grown used to for years. But within minutes, that calm would be torn apart by an event the city had never imagined and was nowhere near ready to confront. Inside a small home on Fairfield Street, a mother was stepping into an argument she believed could be resolved with a simple call to the police. She had no way of knowing that this call, something so routine for law enforcement agencies across the country, would become the gateway to the darkest tragedy the Pittsburgh Police Department had faced in nearly 18 years. When the dispatcher asked what was happening, the mother's voice trembled slightly, though she tried to remain composed. She only wanted her son to leave the house. A common family dispute. A small argument that started because the dog had urinated on the carpet. Something ordinary. Something real. Something very American. But no one knew that upstairs, her son, Richard Poplawski, 22 years old, was putting on a bulletproof vest, placing weapons around him, and preparing for what he believed would be a battle. At 7:11 a.m., the first two officers received the call. They had no idea they were walking into a home that, just 1 minute later, would become the place that changed the fate of their families and this entire city. Neighbors were still opening garage doors, getting ready to drive to work. None of them could have imagined that the gunfire about to erupt would haunt Stanton Heights for years to come. 911 call. A detail that seemed so small, but it became the spark that ignited a tragedy that not only claimed the lives of 3 officers, but also left the Pittsburgh community questioning how an ordinary household dispute could escalate so far. This is not just a story about guns. It is a story about people, about choices, about moments that seal our fate, and about 3 men who walked out of their homes that morning and never came back. To understand the tragedy that unfolded that morning, we need to step deeper into the relationship between Richard Poplawski and his mother. It was a relationship filled with love, filled with conflict, a relationship where Richard found his last bit of protection, but also the years-long tension that fed his instability. In many ways, it was a live wire waiting for the spark. Margaret Poplawski was the definition of a working-class American mother. She worked hard, complained little, and always tried to give her only son the best she could. But raising a child with deep emotional instability is never easy. When Richard was young, she chose silence. She chose patience. She chose to soothe his anger with the hope that someday he would grow out of it. But over time, that patience became a pattern, a habit, a reflex. And Margaret, loving as she was, became part of the environment that kept Richard from ever facing the root of his darkness. Not because she wanted to contribute to the problem, but because she believed she had no other choice. Neighbors recalled hearing the two of them argue often. When he was younger, it sounded like the usual tension between a rebellious teen and a mother trying desperately to keep the household from collapsing. But as Richard grew older, the arguments changed. They no longer stopped at words. They exploded into rage, objects thrown, doors slammed, nights spent in silence, not because things were resolved, but because both were too exhausted to keep fighting. In American culture, especially in middle-class communities like Pittsburgh, families often keep their struggles private. They don't want judgment. They don't want others to know what's happening behind closed doors. Margaret was the same. She rarely asked for help, rarely told anyone that her son was headed down a dangerous path. She believed she could handle it, but what she hid was exactly what was growing into the Richard of April 4. In the years leading up to the shooting, Richard became increasingly involved in extremist online forums. Spaces filled with anti-government rhetoric, racist ideology, and promises of a world where he would no longer feel powerless. For an isolated young man, those voices felt like validation, like toxic comfort. When a person who feels lost finds a community that claims to speak the truth he wants to hear, the line between belief and reality becomes fragile. Margaret noticed the changes. He spent more time in his room. He spoke less. He withdrew from everyone. Conversations between mother and son became arguments instead of connection. And slowly, their home stopped feeling safe. It became a place where both held their breath whenever they heard the other's footsteps. There were moments when Richard tried to stabilize his life, but he failed. Moments when he took a job only to get fired. Moments when he returned to his mother in desperation. But these were temporary. His worsening mental state, rising anger, and belief that the world was against him pushed him further from reality with each passing month. And then, something that seemed insignificant, a dog, a stain on the carpet. But that was never the real cause. It was simply the final drop in a bucket that had been overflowing for years. Arguments over household discipline had gone on for so long that this time, what Margaret thought was a simple correction turned into the trigger for Richard's explosion. His mother still believed that calling the police would calm things down, just like before. Officers had come to the house in the past, and things had ended quietly. But on that morning, Richard was no longer the Richard from years prior. His mind had shifted far past the point of balance. And Margaret, the woman who had tried to hold him together for more than 20 years, didn't know that as she stepped into the hallway to dial 911, her son was upstairs wearing a bulletproof vest, surrounding himself with weapons, convinced the police were coming to take his life. Sometimes, a tragedy doesn't come from one moment, it comes from years of buildup, from wounds never treated, from anger never understood, from cries for help never spoken, and from a family that looked ordinary from the outside, but was actually caught in a psychological storm far too powerful to escape. On the morning of April 4, a mother called the police, simply hoping for a little peace inside her own home. She could not know that this call would become the final step into a tragedy that could never be undone. On the morning of April 4, 2009, Stanton Heights woke up like any typical American neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes along the sidewalks. Wooden gates opened and closed. Adults prepared for their morning shifts. Early spring sunlight filtered through the branches. Everything felt peaceful, so peaceful that no one could imagine that within minutes, the entire neighborhood would be swallowed by the roar of gunfire. Inside 1016 Fairfield Street, Margaret Poplawski was starting a familiar but heavy morning. An unpleasant smell from the carpet made her frown. One of Richard's 2 dogs had made a mess. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that happens in homes with pets across America. But for this family, it touched a nerve that had been strained for years. Margaret walked upstairs to talk to her son. Her voice wasn't loud, but enough to stir something dangerous beneath the surface. Richard exploded, instantly angry, harsh, out of control. It wasn't the first time, but this morning, something felt different, darker. As if every fragment of unresolved emotion gathered over the years suddenly cracked wide open. The next few minutes were what psychologists call the breaking point. A fragile line that, once crossed, logic can no longer anchor a person. Richard paced the room, breathing hard, staring at his mother with a conflicted intensity. In his mind, small things became threats. Ordinary words twisted into attacks. And the most frightening truth was this: neither of them realized the tragedy had already begun. Margaret stepped out of the room. She believed that calling the police would settle things just like before. She didn't know Richard was strapping on a bulletproof vest and placing weapons around him. She believed officers would arrive, talk to him, calm him down, and restore peace. At 7:03 a.m. she picked up the phone. The familiar long beep of a 911 line echoed. A young dispatcher less than a year on the job answered with a steady, practiced tone. A tone Americans recognize as the sound of safety. Margaret explained she wanted officers to remove her son from the home. She made clear that Richard had guns, and that they were legally owned. She emphasized she wasn't being threatened with a weapon, but she kept repeating that she feared things might get out of control. In that moment, a mistake occurred. The dispatcher, typing quickly to enter information for police coordination, clicked the wrong box. A single line appeared: no weapons. A simple data entry error. One small mistake among many that happened during busy morning calls. But in this situation, it became one of the most devastating errors in the history of Allegheny County's 911 system. Imagine this: 2 officers being dispatched to a routine family dispute. No weapons, no threats, no violence. A scenario they had handled hundreds of times in their careers. And because of that false information, they approached the house without tactical caution. They walked up expecting a conversation, not an ambush. Meanwhile, Richard stood on the staircase listening to his mother's call. His mind stretched tight like a wire. In his head, her words twisted into images of police coming to take his rights away. A dangerous cocktail of extremist delusion, betrayal, and fear of losing control. The kind of fear that drives people to unimaginable actions. At 7:11 a.m., the first 2 officers approached the door. They didn't know that on the other side was a young man zipping up a bulletproof vest, finger hovering near a trigger, convinced he was about to enter a life-or-death battle. A battle he believed in because of the extremist posts. He had read online posts that filled his mind with the idea that societal collapse was near, and he needed to fight back. His mother remained on the porch, worried but confident police would defuse the situation. She didn't know that within seconds, her son, the boy she raised, protected, and hoped for, would kill 3 innocent men. All because of a single flash in a fractured mind. If the dispatcher had not checked no weapons, the approach would have changed. If the warning about a bulletproof vest had been recorded, the strategy would have been different. But that morning, one mistyped line, one small break in the chain, opened the door to the loss of 3 lives. A normal morning. A normal call. But its ending would change Pittsburgh forever. 7:11 a.m. In a quiet corner of Pittsburgh, 2 young officers were stepping into a call they believed would last no more than a few minutes. Just a family dispute. No weapons. No violence. No serious threat. At least, that was what the 911 system had told them. Officer Paul Cielo stepped out of the patrol car first. He was 37, lean, quick, calm. Friends described him as the kind of man who would help anyone, even with the smallest neighborhood problem. Walking right behind him was Stephen Mayle, 29 years old, father of 2 young daughters. His colleagues said he always smiled, no matter how long or how heavy the shift was. That quiet steadiness made him an anchor within the team. As they climbed the steps of 1016 Fairfield, neither of them sensed danger. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't wear ballistic helmets. They didn't move in tactical formation. In American law enforcement culture, domestic disputes are often approached with calmness and empathy, a conversation, a bit of mediation, minimal force. But this house was no longer a normal house. As the 2 officers stopped at the door, only a few thin inches of wood separated them from Richard Poplawski, a young man with his finger wrapped around the trigger of a rifle, eyes fixed on the entryway, ready to fire the moment the door shifted open. This is the moment tactical experts call the blind threshold, the dead zone, where officers cannot see inside, but the person inside can see everything. And with the no weapons note in the system, Cielo and Mayle approached as if they were meeting a distressed family. They had no idea that one step too close, one breath too slow, one familiar movement could make them targets. Under standard protocol, if weapons had been reported, they would have approached at an angle, keeping distance, using cover, clearing both sides of the frame. But that morning, they didn't, not out of negligence, but because they trusted the information they were given. Cielo knocked on the door. Mayle stood directly behind him, upright, unshielded, not leaning left or right. An open stance. The stance of someone expecting a mother to answer and explain her son's behavior. Not someone preparing for an ambush. The door swung open. Not by the mother, but by Richard. And in that split second, there was no time to think, speak, or react. The first shot tore across the narrow space, striking Cielo in the head. Instantly. No warning. No chance to pull his weapon. No chance to step aside. Mail saw only the collapse of his partner. In that instant, training kicked in. He raised his firearm, doing exactly what an officer is trained to do. But there was no time. The second shot came fast, precise, merciless. Mail fell beside his partner. From a tactical perspective, this was the nightmare scenario. The suspect possessed the superior position. He could see from above. He had prepared. He could fire before officers even saw him. This is why every detail in a 911 dispatch matters, why a single phrase can be the difference between life and death. But from the human perspective, the loss is immeasurable. 2 young officers. 2 men with families. With children. With dreams. With weekend plans. With lives of their own, just like any of us. And they walked up to that door simply to bring safety to a worried mother inside her home. When the gunshots rang out, neighbors were stunned. They heard rapid bursts, then a terrible silence. A silence not because the event was over, but because the tragedy had only just begun. In less than 10 seconds, 2 officers lay fallen at the front door of 1016 Fairfield. 2 families lost their pillars. And a city unaware of what was coming next was only moments away from even greater loss. In cases that shake an entire community, there is always a single moment when everything shifts from tension to chaos. In the Pittsburgh shooting that morning, that moment happened so fast that investigators later had to rely on ballistics evidence, trajectory mapping, and the few surviving witness statements to reconstruct the events second by second. And when they pieced it together, the full picture became clearer, darker, and far more tragic. After Silo and Mail knocked on the door, Richard was positioned above them on the staircase. That elevated angle is what law enforcement tactical teams call a kill zone. The person above has a wider firing arc, better visibility, and complete control of movement below. The officers, standing on a narrow front porch, essentially had no cover at all. The moment the door shifted, the first shot exploded, fired from a 12-gauge shotgun. Ballistics confirmed the slug traveled on a direct downward trajectory, entering through the front portion of Officer Ciello's skull. No deviation, no obstruction. This indicated Richard had pre-aimed his position, had the weapon angled perfectly, and had waited patiently for the exact instant to fire. The second shot followed almost immediately. Mail didn't have time to draw his weapon, though evidence shows he had begun lifting his right hand in reaction. The trajectory entered at a slightly lower angle, proving Richard adjusted his aim within fractions of a second. To forensic ballistic experts, that demonstrated an adrenaline-charged firing reflex, violent, unhesitating, instinctive. Both officers fell almost simultaneously. But the tragedy did not stop there. Officer Eric Kelly, who was off duty and driving home after a night shift, heard the distress call over the radio. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for orders. Guided by instinct and years of experience, he drove straight to the scene, despite having no clear information and knowing the situation was rapidly escalating. As Kelly stepped out of his vehicle, Richard fired again, this time using a semi-automatic AK-style rifle, a weapon capable of high-speed fire, deep penetration, and dangerously sharp lateral trajectories in tight spaces like the front yard and hallway. Ballistics showed that the round hitting Kelly followed a diagonal path from his right side downward into his lower abdomen and hip. This suggests Kelly was turning, likely trying to crouch for cover, or calling out to the fallen officers in front of him. That moment lasted less than half a second. And in that half second, a single round changed the course of his family's life forever. Kelly collapsed, gravely wounded, but conscious. Witnesses later described seeing him lying on the concrete, raising his hand toward another officer running in his direction, Officer Timothy McManaway, who had heard the rapid fire from 2 blocks away. McManaway ran in without thinking of himself. As he reached Kelly, he was struck by a round to the arm. Forensics showed the bullet traveled through his forearm and lodged near the muscle of his upper arm. Despite the injury, McManaway dragged Kelly behind a parked car, an act of instinct, loyalty, and desperation. The act of an officer unwilling to leave his brother behind, even as the situation spiraled out of control. Inside the house, Richard kept firing, relentlessly, not with calculated precision, but with a spiral of panic and extremism. Forensics later determined that the AK malfunctioned once jamming briefly. In that moment, Richard switched to handguns. 3 different ones, a .38, a .357 Magnum, and a .45 caliber pistol. This told investigators Richard hadn't prepared for a confrontation, he had prepared for a prolonged gunfight. When SWAT arrived, they heard continuous bursts from inside. Based on the sound profile and distance between shots, Richard moved between the bedroom and the top of the stairs, then back again. Several rounds were later found embedded in the wall behind the dining room, indicating he fired blindly at any noise he heard outside. By the end of the incident, more than 600 shell casings were recovered from the house, an almost unbelievable number for such a small residence. Bullet holes riddled the door, the walls, the stair railings, each one telling the same story: a young man consumed by fear, extremism, and total loss of control. Someone firing not to defend himself, but to destroy anything he perceived as a threat. But hidden in those same ballistic patterns was another story, the story of 3 officers who walked into danger without knowing they were already inside a sniper's line of fire. And a 4th officer, wounded but still trying to save his fallen brothers as bullets ripped through the air. When investigators mapped the full trajectory patterns, they realized something heartbreaking: there was no second, no position, no movement, no angle that would have allowed the officers to survive the first minutes. Every step, every approach, ever. When the first bursts of gunfire cracked through Fairfield Street, the entire Stanton Heights neighborhood fell into a state that witnesses later described with only one phrase: pure disbelief. No one imagined the place where they walked their dogs every morning, where kids played catch in front yards, could transform into a war zone in just minutes. But for Pittsburgh police, the chaos was only the beginning. From the moment Cielo and Mail fell, the situation was no longer a family dispute. It had escalated into the most dangerous armed confrontation the department had faced in more than 18 years. When radio calls confirmed that 2 officers were down, the rapid response units were immediately mobilized. But before they even arrived, another message broke through: a 3rd officer critically wounded, and gunfire still erupting inside the small house. SWAT was activated. From across the city, SWAT operators wearing heavy body armor, ballistic helmets, carrying tactical rifles drove at maximum speed toward the scene. And when they arrived, they saw a sight many of them would never forget. 2 officers lay motionless on the front steps. Another was being dragged behind a parked car. Their dark blue uniforms starkly contrasted with the gray pavement and the splashes of red surrounding them. But the sound of gunfire was what cut deepest, sharp, relentless, echoing between the houses like a warning that stepping out of cover could be fatal. SWAT immediately established a perimeter. 3 teams were formed, one covering the front, one circling to the back for visual angles, and one taking elevated positions to monitor movement inside. Their strategy was clear: hold distance, contain the suspect, prevent him from escaping, and keep stray rounds from reaching civilians. But one huge problem remained: 3 wounded officers were lying dangerously close to the front door, needing medical extraction. Yet inside, Richard kept firing, aimless, sporadic, unpredictable, at any motion he perceived. Years later, a SWAT officer said it was the first time in his career he felt helpless. Not because they lacked skill or equipment, but because their brothers were lying just a few yards away and they couldn't reach them. Anyone who tried would end up like the first 3. Gunfire continued in waves. Forensics would later confirm that Richard fired over 600 rounds during the 4-hour standoff, an astonishing amount of ammunition for a 22-year-old living with his mother. Even more disturbing, bullet trajectories showed shots fired from multiple rooms. He moved through the hallway, retreated to the bedroom, returned to the staircase, Some rounds pierced walls. Some struck the railing. Some landed in the backyard. All of it indicated he was still alert, still moving, still trapped inside an extremist hallucination where the police were an existential threat. SWAT adapted second by second. They used an armored vehicle to inch toward the front door, but every attempt was met with fresh gunfire from a second-floor window. The rounds struck the armor with harsh metallic thuds, the sound of a gunman still fully capable of fighting. For 4 hours no resident stepped outside. No window opened. No one dared approach the street. Some families huddled with children in their basements. Others peeked from behind curtains, staring at a scene they never imagined witnessing on their quiet block. Then, amid the chaos, a faint voice came from inside the house. Richard's voice. Weak. Breaking. He said he'd been shot in the leg, that he couldn't move, that he wanted to surrender. It was the first sign of change in 4 relentless hours. Negotiator Craig Campbell took position immediately. Speaking with a steady, controlled voice, he urged Richard to crawl toward the window, to raise his hands, to show SWAT he was no longer armed. Throughout the dialogue, SWAT operators kept their rifles trained on the windows. No one knew whether this was genuine surrender or a trap. But after several tense minutes, Richard appeared hands raised, face pale from blood loss. And with that moment, the 4-hour siege reached its end. As they handcuffed him, blood dripped down his leg. But none of the officers saw the delusional warrior he imagined himself to be. They saw a broken young man consumed by extremism, fear, and rage. A man who had taken the lives of 3 officers who simply came to help his mother. 4 hours. 600 rounds. More than 100 officers deployed. All culminating in a single moment, Richard collapsing on the porch, hands still in the air, as if realizing that the only real battle that morning had been the one unfolding inside his own mind. As the ambulance took him away, Pittsburgh began to understand that this morning was not just another shooting. It was the greatest tragedy the city's law enforcement had faced in nearly 2 decades, a tragedy that would leave a permanent scar, not just in police records, but in TH. In the most chaotic minutes of that morning, while gunfire erupted in waves, while SWAT struggled to get close to the house, while fallen officers lay motionless on the porch, and the entire neighborhood stood frozen in fear, something unexpected happened. A new 911 call came in. A call no one ever imagined. It came from Richard Poplawski himself. In the world of criminal investigation, moments like this are extraordinarily rare. A gunman who has just killed 3 officers, still barricaded inside, still firing out the windows, suddenly picks up a phone and calls 911. Not to taunt. Not to threaten, but to say he was lying in a pool of his own blood. When the dispatcher answered, the first thing she heard wasn't the voice of a raging extremist. It was heavy breathing, strained, breaking off as if the caller's body was beginning to shut down. Then Richard's voice, hoarse, fragmented. "I've been shot. I'm lying in my own blood. I can't move." For those who later listened to the recording, the haunting part wasn't the confession. It was the fear behind every word. A man responsible for unspeakable harm just minutes earlier, yet when he himself was wounded, when his body weakened, when the heat of adrenaline faded beneath all the extremism and violence, was still a 22-year-old young man gasping in panic. The dispatcher remained calm, exactly as she had been trained to do. She asked whether he still had weapons, whether he could put them down. Richard answered with the trembling voice of someone who finally understood the situation was beyond his control. "I'm not shooting anymore. My guns are empty. I can't shoot anybody now." But moments later, he spoke of death. "I think I'm gonna die from blood loss. I don't know how much longer I have." These weren't excuses. They were the words of a mind collapsing after adrenaline drained away, the moment when fanaticism dissolves and reality slams into focus. He had driven himself to the edge. When negotiator Craig Campbell was patched into the call, the tone shifted. No more short questions, no scripted commands. This was a moment where one human being had to reach another. Campbell called Richard buddy man, even partner. He used plain, gentle language steady, non-threatening. He listened. He reassured him that no one would fire as long as Richard didn't fire again. Slowly, Richard began talking. He said he heard footsteps. He said he saw the bodies of the officers at the door. He said each time he tried to move, more blood poured from his leg. Without intending to, he was confessing, not confessing guilt in the legal sense, but confessing that he had completely lost the battle he believed he was fighting. The most chilling line of the entire call came next, a line that silenced the entire courtroom when it was played years later. "This was an unfortunate incident, sir." Not quite an apology, but the first moment where truth pierced the extremist illusion that had guided him for years. Campbell urged him to crawl toward the window, to show his hands, one slow step at a time, guiding him like someone leading a panicked person through a storm. But Richard was terrified. Terrified of being shot. Terrified police would mistake a movement for aggression. Terrified they would end his life with a single misread gesture. "I can't raise my hands. I can only wave this sandal." The negotiator stayed patient. In moments like this, humanity is the only tool. And because of that patience, SWAT finally saw the signal. They saw Richard crawl into the position Campbell described. They saw his trembling hands, his face pale from blood loss, his guns left behind in the house. When Richard emerged, the air still carried the harsh smell of gunpowder. Morning light spilled across the porch, illuminating his body. And in that moment, despite the fact that he had killed 3 officers, there was a stark, almost unsettling human contrast. A young man, 22 years old, blood soaking down his pants, hands in the air, no rage, no shouting, only fear, and the quiet awareness that everything was over. SWAT cuffed him and moved him away from the scene. And that morning ended with an image Pittsburgh would carry for years, the image of a 911 call. No one expected a call where the gunman confessed, pleaded, and revealed the final, panicked unraveling of his mind. In cases like this, Poplawski's call isn't just evidence. It is a psychological snapshot, a moment where violence is peeled back, revealing something uncomfortable behind the brutality. Was a distorted mind, a life pushed into extremism, and a young man nowhere near as invincible as the persona he tried to create. Poplawski's 911 call didn't save the 3 fallen officers. It didn't erase the tragedy. But it showed something important, that even in the darkest crimes, the human element still exists, raw, fragile, and painfully real. When the gunfire finally stopped, when the scene was contained, when the 3 fallen officers had been taken away, and when Poplawski lay on a stretcher with a blank, distant stare, the investigation shifted inward. Not just to learn what happened, but to answer the most painful question of all: how did a 22-year-old from a quiet Pittsburgh neighborhood become the source of one of the city's worst tragedies? The answer lived in a place few people ever think to look: in the darkest corners of the internet, where loneliness, anger, and alienation can become combustible. According to investigative records, years before the shooting, Poplawski had already slipped into another world. A world with no one to challenge him, no one to correct him, no one to pull him away from the edge. That world was called Stormfront. Stormfront wasn't just a website. It was a community built around white supremacist ideology, conspiracy theories, and a narrative of victimhood written by its own members. And for a young man who already felt rejected by society, it became the place where he believed he had finally found truth. In criminal psychology, there is a concept known as an echo chamber, a place where one's beliefs are continually reflected back, reinforced, and amplified. Stormfront was exactly that. Poplawski didn't just read. He began posting, connecting with others who shared his anger, building a universe where he convinced himself America was collapsing, that his rights were being taken, and that violence could be justified. Years after the shooting, SPLC Mark Potok described Poplawski as a textbook example of a young man radicalized by extremist ideology, not because he was born violent, but because he felt lost, directionless, and the internet gave him a sense of belonging. Even more concerning, Stormfront wasn't the only place influencing him. He followed InfoWars, a site infamous for conspiracy theories, secret government camps, shadow groups controlling the nation, economic collapse, racial war. Stories without evidence, yet dangerously compelling to someone searching for meaning. In his posts, Poplawski referenced ZOG, the conspiracy claiming the government is controlled by Jewish interests. He wrote about economic collapse, racial conflict, and a coming revolution he believed he needed to prepare for. His writing didn't reflect a stable mind. It was a blend of paranoia, rage, and the belief he was fighting an invisible enemy. In forensic psychology, this is a classic pattern of cognitive distortion. When someone slips into extremism, they stop simply believing an idea, they become consumed by it. Every failure, losing a job, relationship troubles, family conflict gets blamed on the enemy they imagine. For Poplawski, that enemy was the government, the police, and anyone he believed threatened his freedom. The most heartbreaking part is that no one in his family knew how far he had fallen. His mother, Margaret, had her own struggles, but she had no idea her son was diving into extremist forums every night. She didn't know he was staying up late reading hate-filled posts. She didn't know the room he grew up in had become a chamber where radicalism fused into his identity. The truth is painful. This tragedy might have been preventable. If someone close to him had noticed the warning, signs, a shift in language, a change in his eyes, an increasingly hostile view of the world, perhaps something could have been done. But no one saw it, not because they didn't care, but because the signs in the beginning were small, subtle, quiet, like a breeze slipping through a cracked door. Investigators later said that when they opened Poplawski's computer, they found hundreds of posts, hundreds of lines documenting his obsessions. And they realized the shooting didn't begin that morning. It had been years in the making, growing in the dark corners that no one ever looked into. In one photo he uploaded to Stormfront, he showed off an iron eagle tattoo, a symbol associated with European far-right ideology. He wrote about America's collapse, about violence being inevitable, about the need to be prepared. These ideas didn't appear from nowhere. They were nurtured, reinforced, and finally acted upon when a simple argument with his mother spiraled out of control that morning. Forensic psychology makes something clear. Poplawski's violence wasn't spontaneous. It was the final step in a long path, a path built from unaddressed anger, deep isolation, and extremist ideology filling the space that family, friends, and society failed to reach. In the end, when the three officers entered that home, they didn't just encounter a violent young man. They encountered years of radicalization, an obsession growing in silence, and a worldview that Richard believed was the only truth. That is why this part of the case is essential in every true crime record. Because it doesn't just explain what happened, it explains why. And it reminds us in America's most devastating cases, people often remember the gunman, the violence, the chaos. But in Pittsburgh, and for the families who carry the deepest scars of that morning, three names matter more than anything else. Eric Kelly, Stephen Mayle, Paul Ciello. Their names do not live only in reports or on plaques. They live in the streets of this city, in the hearts of those they left behind, and in the promise that their sacrifice will never fade. Paul was 37. He spent his entire life in Pittsburgh. The whole neighborhood knew him, remembered him, and loved him like their own. He had a smile you could recognize from a block away, warm, quick, unmistakably genuine. He loved his job, loved his family, and loved the simple American life he built day by day. Friends said Paul wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he had a way of making others feel safe. He didn't become a police officer for recognition. He did it because he wanted to be useful. He wanted to make something better. He wanted to wear the badge with humility and responsibility. He was engaged to be married. That is the detail that breaks the most hearts. The ring he picked out for his fiancée still sits in a drawer, a promise that never had the chance to be fulfilled. His death shattered his family. A father who now looks at his son's picture on the news, instead of across the dinner table. a mother who still waits for a door that will never open again. Stephen was 29, much younger than most of the officers who fell that morning. But to his family, he had been grown for years. He was the kind of man who cared for others before himself. Every dinner, every birthday, every small family moment he was there, present, gentle, devoted. He had 2 little daughters, girls far too young to understand why their father wasn't coming home. That is one of the deepest pains of this case: children who will grow up without a father at their graduation, at their first bike ride, in their wedding pictures. It is an emptiness that never fully heals. After the shooting, Stephen's wife said the memory she cherished most wasn't their wedding or their trips, but the way he walked through the door every evening smiling as if something good was waiting for him inside. That smile became her legacy. Eric was 41, father to 3 daughters, husband to a woman who believed he was the strongest pillar of their family. He had just finished a long overnight shift, only minutes from home. A few more blocks and he could have turned off the radio, opened the front door, hugged his wife, and kissed his girls. Then the call came through. 2 officers down, and in that instant, the instincts of a police officer, a father, a protector, took over. Eric turned his car around without hesitation. He didn't go because he was assigned. He went because it was the right thing to do. When he ran towards Cielo and Mail, he didn't know he would become the 3rd target. He didn't know the gunman was waiting behind the doorway. He saw only 2 fallen officers and he ran. Eric couldn't save them. But his courage became the story the entire city carried. He was the man who wasn't called, but still answered. Who wasn't ordered, but still showed up. Who wasn't asked, but still laid down his life. His sacrifice rose above duty. It became a symbol. When Pittsburgh held the memorial service, thousands of officers arrived from states across the country. People lined the streets, hands over their hearts, as they said goodbye to the 3 men who fell for their community. No one spoke the gunman's name that day. They spoke about Paul's smile, Stephen's tenderness, Eric's fearless loyalty. In department records, they are listed as 3 Pittsburgh police officers. But in the hearts of the public, they were fathers, sons, husbands, and citizens who lived their lives believing that doing the right thing is always worth it. Their legacy does not rest in medals or headlines. It lives in the way the community held each other closer after the tragedy. In the look of determination worn by every new recruit entering the academy. In the honor oath spoken louder than ever, because they know they are stepping into the path built by those who gave everything. Their sacrifice didn't end on April 4th. It continues every day in the families they left behind, in the community they protected, and in the understanding that the safety of a city is held by people brave enough to stand in harm's way. In every major American tragedy, there is always one moment that haunts people the most. One small detail. One small decision. A moment where, if things had gone just slightly differently, everything might have changed. In the Pittsburgh shooting of 2009, that moment lived inside a single line of text on a 911 dispatcher's computer screen: no weapons. 2 words. Short, but the price they carried was as long as an indictment. Margaret Poplawski had clearly told the dispatcher that her son owned guns, that the weapons were legal, but present inside the home. But when the information was entered into the system, when the dispatcher relayed it to police operations, the line appeared as if she had said nothing about weapons at all. In forensic communications, this is considered a critical failure. Not because someone intentionally ignored the information, but because the system relies on 2 human factors: training and psychological pressure. The dispatcher that morning had been on the job for less than a year. She was juggling a stressful domestic disturbance call. And somehow when Margaret mentioned that her son had guns, the dispatcher interpreted it as a statement of ownership, not a statement of immediate threat. So she entered it into the system in the opposite direction: no weapons involved in the conflict. In emergency communications where information passes through several layers, a tiny deviation can alter the entire tactical response. And in this case, it became a fatal blind spot. When officers Sealo and Mail arrived at the door, they believed they were responding to a typical family dispute. No guns. No one armed. No risk of ambush. They approached with the mindset of mediators, a mindset completely at odds with the reality waiting behind the doorframe. Forensic analysis later concluded that if the officers had known Poplawski was wearing body armor, if they had known he had retrieved firearms, if they had known he was preparing an ambush position, they would have approached differently. They would have kept their distance. They would have waited for backup. They would have chosen a tactical advantage rather than walking directly into the line of fire, and maybe, just maybe, they would not have fallen in the first few seconds. But forensic experts also pointed out a harder truth: no one was at fault. No one acted recklessly. No one wanted any of this to happen. The dispatcher was doing her best. The officers followed protocol. And the world simply needed one single link in the chain to slip for everything to collapse into the darkness of a morning full of gunfire. After the shooting, an internal investigation into Allegheny County's 9/11 system began. Recordings were reviewed. Data entry logs were examined. Procedures were analyzed. And forensic communication specialists identified several vulnerabilities, gaps that stay hidden during ordinary days, but become painfully clear when pressure spikes. The most important truth was this: America's 911 system, no matter how advanced, still rests on human beings. And human beings, even the best trained, are capable of mistakes, especially in environments where every second can mean life or death. The dispatcher was placed on temporary leave. Not as punishment, but because she needed psychological support. She needed counseling. She needed time to face the painful reality that her error, unintentional as it was, had led to unimaginable consequences. A burden no one in that profession ever wishes to carry. Months later, forensic communication experts proposed procedural changes. They recommended stricter verification of weapon-related information, a secondary confirmation filter, a supervisor check for high-risk call details before dispatch. Small adjustments, but ones that could make an enormous difference. No one can know whether these improvements could have saved the 3 officers that morning. But Pittsburgh knew they had to change, to make sure no future tragedy would hinge on such a small oversight. In a speech after the incident, the governor of Pennsylvania said something people still remember: a strong system is not built on technology. It is built on humans who must be protected from error so they can protect everyone else. The line hit deeply within the profession. Because whether we talk about the path of the shooter, the sacrifice of the officers, or the devastation of the families, we must always come back to the human factor. The most decisive element in every emergency call, the most fragile element, and the one most in need of support. The 911 system's failure did not add blame to anyone's shoulders. But it illustrated a lesson every American city must remember: public safety isn't held only by officers on the street. It is also held by the people behind the screens, the ones who listen, type, and relay that crucial information. They are part of the front line too. And when a tragic morning unfolds because of a single incorrect line, when the final gunshot faded, when Richard Poplawski was carried out bleeding, and when the neighborhood was cleared inch by inch, the hardest work was only beginning. The crime scene was not just the place where 3 officers fell. It was a maze of hundreds of bullets, hundreds of fragments, and hundreds of questions Pittsburgh needed answered. The crime scene investigators entered the small house, quietly, not rushing, not speaking loudly. They walked as if stepping into the memory of a tragic morning. Every brick, every divot in the wall, every splintered piece of wood, all of it carried the story of those horrifying seconds. Forensics begins in silence, a silence that honors the fallen. And then science speaks. From the outside, the 2-story home looked peacefully ordinary. But once investigators stepped inside, they saw a place torn apart by chaotic gunfire. More than 600 rounds, fired from multiple positions: the doorway, the hallway, the bedroom, the top of the stairs. The ballistics team went to work, kneeling, measuring angles, marking entry points, reconstructing trajectories. Each bullet told a piece of the story that no human witness could have fully seen. The round that killed Officer Cielo came from a low angle, a precise ambush shot fired almost the instant the door opened. The trajectory was straight, clean, and uninterrupted. It showed Poplawski had positioned himself ahead of time, lying in wait. A deliberate ambush. The bullet that killed Officer Mayle came from the same angle, but its trajectory revealed something else. Mayle had fired back. One of his rounds struck the wall only centimeters from Poplawski's position. A small detail. But to forensics, it was proof of courage, proof that Mayle fought until his last breath. The bullets that struck Officer Kelly came from higher angles. This showed that Poplawski had risen, moved, and repositioned himself at the top of the staircase. It meant that after killing the first two officers, he changed vantage points, actively preparing for whoever came next. Forensic analysts call this the escalation point, the moment a gunman stops reacting and starts preparing for further confrontation. Bullet by bullet, second by second, the team reconstructed the early minutes of the tragedy, every decision, every movement, every pull of the trigger. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air hours after the shooting. But for forensics, smell wasn't enough. They needed samples, analysis, patterns. Gunpowder residue was heavy on the living room floor, on the stair railing, near the upstairs window, on Poplawski's ballistic vest. Each location revealed something crucial. The residue on the stair railing confirmed Poplawski fired from an elevated position after Cielo and Mayle were already down, meaning he wasn't shooting blindly. He was adjusting angles, shifting tactics, responding to incoming backup. Residue on the AK-style rifle showed the barrel had overheated, proof of rapid, sustained fire. The kind that doesn't pause, doesn't hesitate, doesn't reassess. Gunpowder on his vest was thick, a signature pattern known as close-quarter discharge, only created when the shooter fires extremely close to the doorway, exactly where the first ambush happened. Taken together, the residue patterns revealed a disturbing truth, that morning was not impulsive. It was the explosive release of years of buildup, a moment he had mentally prepared for. Reconstruction is not just science. It is the art of reassembling time. It is how forensic experts give the fallen a voice, how they tell the story that no one else survived to tell. The team built a 3D model of the house, every bullet path, every angle, every cluster of rounds, every sound from police radio logs, combined with timestamps from Poplawski's later 9/11 call. Piece by piece, they formed a complete timeline. 7:03 a.m. 911 dispatch sends the call to Cielo and Mayle. 7:15 a.m. The door opens. The first shot. Both officers fall within seconds. 7:16 a.m. Officer Kelly hears the radio. He turns around. 7:17 a.m. Kelly is shot. McManaway is hit while trying to drag him to safety. 7:28:30 a.m. Waves of gunfire. Poplawski moves between rooms, firing whenever he hears movement outside. 8:38 a.m. A SWAT sniper hits Poplawski in the leg. 8:50 a.m. Poplawski calls 911. The call lasts exactly 50 minutes. Just before 11:00 a.m. Poplawski surrenders. 4 hours in total. But forensics saw far more than a timeline. They saw bravery. They saw officers pulling each other away from death. They saw 911 operators fighting to stay composed. They saw wounds that lived not just in the bodies of the fallen, but in the hearts of those who watched their brothers lying on the concrete. Reconstruction provided the full picture. Not to cast blame, but to understand. To understand why the morning became so deadly, and why Pittsburgh will never forget it. A veteran investigator said later, "There are cases in America where the trial does not unfold only within four walls. It unfolds in the heart of an entire city, in memories that refuse to settle, and in a silent question families cannot stop asking why." For Richard Poplawski, the courtroom was not simply a place for legal argument. It was where Pittsburgh confronted its own darkness, where the community faced a young man, 22 at the time of the killings, now sitting motionless at the defense table, expressionless, yet still bearing the trace of the chaos that brought him here. On the first day of the trial, the front rows were filled with the families of the 3 fallen officers. Stephen's wife, Paul's mother, Eric Kelly's oldest daughter. Eyes that had no tears left only the weight of a loss that had become permanent. When Poplawski was brought in, no one shouted. No one reacted. But no one looked away either. They looked straight at him not out of hatred, but because they wanted to understand, in the most human sense possible, how could this happen? Prosecutor Mark tranquilly opened with a line that froze the courtroom. Your Honor, these officers did not die because of chaos. They died because of a plan. He emphasized the firing angles, the ambush position, the body armor, the volume of ammunition, the same forensic evidence investigators had reconstructed for months. Then he walked the court through that morning step by step, separating each detail, rebuilding each moment, creating a picture that could not be denied. Poplawski knew officers would respond. He prepared. He waited. And the first shots were not spontaneous. They were a deliberate ambush. People in the gallery bowed their heads not because they didn't know, but because hearing it laid out so clearly was painful. The prosecution ended the opening statement with a line heavy enough to leave the room silent. This was not a shooting. This was the intentional killing of 3 law enforcement officers performing their duty. The defense did not deny that Poplawski fired the shots. They couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming, so they chose another route. They built a different portrait of Poplawski, a lost young man, a boy raised in instability, a teenager pulled into extremist ideologies, a person unable to separate reality from the conspiracies he consumed. The defense argued when a mind becomes disordered, when a person lives too long in isolation, when the darkest corners of the internet become the only education he receives, he will no longer act like a rational human being. They presented psychological evaluations, stress assessments, charts showing long-term paranoid symptoms. Their goal was clear: not to erase guilt, but to avoid the death penalty. The prosecution countered that Poplawski knew exactly what he was doing. They showed evidence that he wore body armor, checked his weapons before officers arrived, peeked through the doorway, chose his timing, and spoke clearly when calling 911 after being wounded. These were not the actions of someone detached from reality. They were the actions of someone fully aware of his choices. A forensic psychologist testified mental illness is not the root here. Extremist ideology is. And ideology is not something that happens to you, it is something you choose and cultivate. Then came the families. Stephen's wife spoke through a breaking voice. I'm not talking about the day I lost my husband. I'm talking about the days my daughters asked me, Mom, where's Dad? And the way I had to push the tears down before answering. Paul's mother whispered every night, I still leave the porch light on. I know it doesn't mean anything, but I can't turn it off. My heart can't stand the thought of leaving my son in the dark. 12-year-old Jennifer Kelly walked up next. Her voice trembled. I miss my dad. But I also miss the last time he hugged me. I want him to know I kept my promise to always be kind. The courtroom was so quiet, people could hear each other breathe. The law requires evidence, but the human heart requires emotional truth. And that morning, the truth was unmistakable. The trial lasted 7 weeks. When the jury finally returned, every eye followed them. The judge asked one question: has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood. His voice was steady, slow, clear. We find the defendant, Richard Poplawski, guilty of first-degree murder, and we unanimously recommend the death penalty. There were no cheers, no applause, only the quiet sobbing of the officers' families, not out of joy, but because justice had finally sat beside them. Softly, honestly, Poplawski did not react. He did not bow his head. He did not cry. He simply stared ahead, as if the distance between him and reality had become too far to close. The death sentence could not bring anyone back. But for Pittsburgh, it affirmed that the lives of those who protect the community matter and violence against them cannot be excused. Yet behind the